1945. The war in Europe had finally ended, but for millions the battle for survival had only just begun. The skies over Germany were silent now. No more bombers, no more sirens, only the haunting echoes of defeat. In that silence, thousands of German women, nurses, secretaries, clerks, and auxiliaries who had served the Reich, were rounded up and handed over to the Allies. Many expected cruelty, hunger, revenge. For years, they had been told that the Americans were monsters. They imagined chains, starvation, and the crack of a whip waiting for them behind the barbed wire. But what awaited them was something they could not comprehend. As trucks rolled into the U.S. prisoner camp, the women sat in tense silence, their hands trembling, their eyes scanning the guarded gates. But instead of harsh orders, they heard polite instructions. Instead of blows, they saw soldiers smiling, even offering water. And when the doors to the mess hall opened, the sight was enough to bring some of them to tears. Tables full of food, fresh bread, steaming soup, butter, coffee, and fruit. It was abundance they hadn't seen in years, not even at home before the war. Many refused to eat at first, believing it was a cruel trick. Others sobbed quietly, whispering that it was impossible, that no enemy could show such mercy. This was not the prison they expected. It was a strange kind of freedom, one that shook everything they thought they knew about war, about America, and about themselves. The first day inside the American camp felt unreal. For the women who had spent months in captivity under German command, surviving bombings, marches, and the collapse of everything they once knew, this place was something beyond imagination. They came through the gates like ghosts, hollow-eyed, covered in dust, the remains of their once proud uniforms clinging loosely to bodies that had long forgotten comfort. The air around them was still heavy with the echoes of war. Somewhere in their minds, they could still hear the screams, the bombs, the crumbling of walls, and the hopeless sound of sirens fading into smoke. When the truck engines went silent, and the gates closed behind them, a thick silence swallowed the group. They stood still, breathing unevenly, expecting a shout, a push, or a blow, the kind of treatment that war had taught them to expect from enemies. But none came. The first voice they heard was calm. A young American soldier, his uniform crisp, his face clean and expression neutral, gestured for them to move forward. He spoke slowly, using a few German words mixed with English. The women looked at each other in confusion. The tone wasn't hostile, it was almost polite. They moved as instructed, clutching the little they carried, a small bag, a scarf, a photograph tucked into a sleeve. Every step they took into the camp felt like walking deeper into an unknown world. The camp itself was not what they expected. They had heard the rumors, terrifying stories spread among the surrendering troops, that the Americans kept their prisoners in brutal conditions, that they humiliated, starved, and beat anyone associated with the Reich. The women had prepared themselves for the worst. Some whispered prayers as they entered, asking God for mercy. Others whispered curses, expecting the end. But the moment they crossed the inner gate, the sight before them broke the image they had carried for years. The camp was clean. Orderly rows of wooden barracks stood under the grey afternoon sky. The paths between them were swept and dry, marked by simple fences and guarded by sentries who looked more like weary young men than vengeful conquerors. No one shouted. No dogs barked. The air carried not the stench of decay, but the faint smell of soap food and smoke from the kitchens. For women who had lived amid chaos, this simple order felt foreign, almost threatening in its calm. One woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with tangled blonde hair tucked beneath a dirty cap, whispered to the one beside her, "Why is it so quiet?" Her voice trembled. The other shrugged, eyes darting toward the guards. "They're waiting," she murmured. "They'll show their true face soon." But as the minutes passed, that face never appeared. Instead, a soldier walked toward them with a crate of tin cups and a bucket of water. He motioned for them to drink. No one moved. They thought it was a test, a trap. Finally, an older woman, gaunt and desperate, stepped forward. She took a cup, raised it carefully to her lips, and drank. Nothing happened. The water was clean, cold, real. That moment changed everything. One by one, others followed. The fear didn't disappear, but it cracked slightly, like ice under the first warmth of spring. Inside the barracks, the women found bunk beds lined neatly, each with a blanket folded at the end. It was not luxury, but after sleeping in barns, cellars, and open fields, it felt almost impossible. A few of them touched the wood, as if confirming it wasn't a trick of the mind. The guards outside spoke softly, issuing instructions through translators. "Rest. You'll be given food soon," they said. The word food echoed like thunder in their empty stomachs. They sat in silence, some crying softly, some staring blankly at the walls. In the corner, two young women whispered about the war, about what they had seen, what they had done. One had been an auxiliary nurse, the other a clerk in a communications unit. They had believed in victory once, believed in the her, in the promises of glory. But now, standing in an American camp, surrounded by soldiers who treated them with unexpected restraint, that belief began to dissolve into something heavy and confusing. There was no revenge here, no whips, no shouting, just structure, discipline, and something else, a strange, quiet dignity. When night came, the women lay on their bunks, too exhausted to sleep. The moonlight slipped through the gaps in the barrack walls, casting long, soft lines across the floor. Outside, the guards talked in low voices, the kind of casual talk soldiers share when the war feels distant for a moment. The women listened, not to understand the words, but to feel the tone. There was no hate in it, no gloating, just life continuing in a way they thought impossible for captors and prisoners. One of them, a teacher from Dresden before the war, sat up and whispered into the dark, "I don't understand them. Why are they being kind?" No one answered. There was no answer that made sense in a world torn apart by cruelty. The next morning they were given soap, water, and small towels. They washed properly, for the first time in weeks. The cold water against their skin felt like rebirth. Their reflection in the tin basins showed faces they barely recognized, hollow cheeks, eyes rimmed with fatigue, but still alive. Some even smiled faintly, ashamed of the relief they felt. When breakfast came, the smell reached them before the sight. Bread, real bread, coffee. Something warm and rich in the air. The women stood in line, uncertain, waiting for the blow that never came. Instead, American cooks, men who could have been their brothers, their sons, handed out trays and nodded politely. "Eat," they said. Still some hesitated. Their hands shook as they accepted the food. They looked at one another for courage. Then one woman, perhaps the youngest among them, took a cautious bite of bread. Her eyes widened, and she began to cry. The others followed. Within minutes, the mess hall was filled with quiet sobs, not of pain, but of disbelief. In those first hours, many of them couldn't speak. The act of being treated like a human again was too much. They had been trained to think of themselves as enemies, as criminals, as women who would pay the price for a lost cause. But here there were no punishments, no shouts of rage, only an unexpected silence and an unfamiliar word: decency. As the day went on, they were allowed to walk the camp yard in small groups. They saw the American flag fluttering high above the administration building. To many of them, it was the symbol of the enemy. Yet now, in the soft wind, it looked different, like a promise rather than a threat. A few even dared to talk to the guards, exchanging shy words through broken phrases and gestures. They found that some of these men had families, wives and children. Some had fought in France or Italy, some had seen horror just as deep as theirs. The lines between us and them began to blur. Still, the mistrust didn't vanish overnight. Some women refused to sleep, afraid that this was only an illusion, that punishment would come later. Others clung to fragments of old propaganda, insisting that the Americans were trying to deceive them before the real cruelty began. But as the days turned to weeks, reality spoke louder than fear. No beatings, no hunger, no degradation, only order, fairness, and food. And so the first cracks in years of indoctrination began to widen. They realized that the world was not as simple as it had been painted. Not all enemies were monsters, not all captors cruel. In that realization, something human returned to them, something that the war had nearly erased. In the quiet of the camp, under the same grey skies that had once rained fire, a strange transformation began, not through speeches or politics, but through small, silent acts of mercy. A cup of water, a folded blanket, a soldier's calm voice saying, "You're safe now." Those simple moments did more than feed or warm them. They began to heal them. When the mess hall doors opened, it was as if time itself paused. The women stood frozen, unable to move, their thin hands gripping the edges of their worn coats. The scent that drifted toward them was something they had not known for years. The deep, comforting aroma of food. Not the sour, musty smell of rations or the bitterness of burnt potatoes, but warmth. The kind that carried memories of home, of mothers stirring soup on quiet evenings, of bread pulled from ovens of safety. That smell alone was enough to shake them. They were marched into the hall slowly, unsure of what they were walking into. Their boots clacked against the wooden floor, echoing against walls that seemed impossibly clean for a prison. Rows of long tables stretched ahead, each lined with trays, plates, and steaming bowls. At the far end, American soldiers in aprons moved briskly, serving portions, organizing utensils, moving with a rhythm that felt almost normal. The women looked at one another, eyes darting in disbelief. This couldn't be real. This wasn't how prisoners were treated. One of the guards spoke, his tone firm but not unkind. "Set, eat." He gestured toward the benches. Still, no one moved. They were waiting for the hidden cruelty to reveal itself. The propaganda they had been fed for years screamed in their minds. The Americans will starve you, humiliate you, make you pay for every bomb that fell on their cities. And yet, there it was: bread, thick soup, slices of meat, even fruit. It was more than any of them had seen in months. Finally, one woman stepped forward. She was tall, her cheeks sunken, her uniform frayed at the edges. She looked down at the plate as if it were a mirage. Slowly, she picked up the spoon, dipped it into the stew, and brought it to her lips. Her eyes closed. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then tears welled up and spilled silently down her face. She kept eating, one trembling spoonful after another, as though afraid that if she stopped, it would all disappear. That was the signal. The hall came alive with motion. Chairs scraped the floor, trays clattered. The women began to eat, at first cautiously, then hungrily. Some crying quietly between bites, others staring in silent disbelief. The soldiers watched from a distance, uncertain of what to do with the sight before them. They had seen the horrors of war too, bodies, starvation, the cruelty of their own kind. But watching these women, former enemies, break down in tears over a bowl of soup touched something deep in them. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. For the women, every mouthful was a storm of emotion. Each bite carried memories of what they had lost. The homes reduced to ash, the families scattered, the lies that had led them here. Many of them had believed they were fighting for something noble. Now, they realized how little that ideology had ever cared for them. Here, in the camp of their so-called enemies, they found the one thing their own leaders had stolen long ago: humanity. Some of the women couldn't finish their meals. The fullness of food after so much hunger made them ill. But even as they sat with hands over their stomachs, a quiet peace began to settle among them. For the first time in years, they felt safe enough to be weak. The American cooks moved quietly between the tables, refilling cups with coffee, offering bread with hesitant smiles. The women didn't know how to respond. They looked down, murmuring thank yous under their breath, not knowing whether gratitude was allowed in war. One young woman, perhaps no older than 19, whispered in broken English, why are you doing this?" The cook paused, confused for a moment. He didn't have a grand answer. "Because you're human," he said simply, then moved on. Those 3 words lingered in her mind long after the meal ended. The next morning the same routine repeated, and the next. Slowly, the disbelief began to fade, replaced by something softer, trust though fragile and uncertain. The women learned the scheduled breakfast at dawn, work assignments through the day, supper before dusk. There were still guards, still fences, still rules. But there were no punishments, no deliberate cruelty, and the meals, consistent, abundant, real, became the heart of that strange new existence. Each tray of food was more than sustenance. It was a message. It said, "You have lost the war, but you have not lost your worth." Over time, the mess hall became a place of quiet reflection. The women would enter in groups, their movements no longer hesitant, but careful, respectful. They talked in whispers, sharing stories about their homes, their pasts, their disbelief. Some had been secretaries in Berlin, others nurses near the front. Some widows of soldiers who would never return. They came from every corner of Germany, but here they shared the same condition, prisoners of both war and of their own broken illusions. As they ate, they sometimes stole glances toward the American soldiers stationed nearby. What they saw unsettled them in ways they couldn't fully express. These men weren't monsters. They were young, ordinary, sometimes even kind. Some whistled softly as they worked. Some looked tired, homesick, just like them. A few even smiled, though cautiously. It was as if both sides were slowly realizing the same truth. The war had forced them to hate people they might have otherwise understood. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the camp in golden light, a small group of women lingered in the mess hall after dinner. They sat quietly, sipping coffee, their hands wrapped around the warmth of their tin cups. The conversation turned to the past, the days before the war. One spoke of her bakery in Munich, another of her little brother who had gone missing near Stalingrad, another of her husband who had died defending Berlin. As the words flowed, the pain softened. For the first time, they were not soldiers, Not enemies, not propaganda's tools. Just women, survivors, human beings caught in history's cruelest storm. The guards didn't interrupt. They let them sit, perhaps sensing that silence and warmth could do what discipline could not: heal. There was one particular night that many of them would remember for years. A storm rolled in, rain hammering against the roofs. The power flickered, and the mess hall lights dimmed. The women, afraid of the dark after so many nights of bombing, gathered close. The American cook, seeing their unease, took out a harmonica and began to play softly, a simple tune, old and haunting. The melody drifted through the hall, wrapping around them like a memory of peace. Some of the women began to hum along, their voices low and uncertain. For a few minutes, there were no sides, no uniforms, no war, just people sharing warmth on a stormy night. By morning, the rain had cleared, and with it, something inside them had shifted forever. Not everyone could accept it easily. There were still women who refused to eat American food, who saw kindness as humiliation. They clung to their anger like a shield, unable to forgive themselves for being fed by those they once despised. But even they could not deny the evidence before them. The steady rhythm of meals, the lack of violence, the simple truth that life here was better than the chaos they'd left behind. The phrase, "so much food and no whips," began as a whisper among them. A quiet, half-incredulous expression passed from one bunk to another. It carried disbelief, gratitude, and shame all at once. Some spoke it bitterly, others with wonder. But every time it was said, it carried the same weight. How could this be possible? As weeks passed, the routine of the mess hall became a ritual of redemption. Each meal was a reminder that survival was no longer a matter of luck or cruelty. Some of the women even began to help in the kitchens, washing dishes, peeling potatoes, stirring soup. They found purpose in the act of creation, in feeding others. The American cooks taught them small things: how to measure ingredients, how to bake with precision. Laughter occasionally replaced silence. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was understanding, a fragile bridge built from the simplest of acts. For many of the women, the meals awakened memories long buried. They remembered the smell of their mothers' kitchens, the warmth of family gatherings before the war had twisted everything. They remembered love. They remembered being human. Some wrote in secret diaries about their astonishment. "They treat us better than our own commanders did." One wrote, "I cannot decide if this is mercy or punishment." Each day ended the same way: empty trays, satisfied silence, a faint sense of dignity returning. Hunger had once been their greatest tormentor. Now, it became the teacher that showed them what kindness really meant. By the time spring came, the disbelief had turned into a kind of gratitude that none of them could express aloud. They had arrived expecting cruelty and humiliation. Instead, they found themselves fed, clothed, and respected. The war had taken everything from them: families, futures, and faith. But in that mess hall, through the simple act of eating, something deep within them began to heal. They still carried guilt, and they always would. But as they looked at the tables filled with food, at the soldiers who served it without hate, they began to understand something larger than defeat. The war had shown them the worst of humanity. This camp, these meals, were showing them the best. And that realization, more than anything, was what broke them open. Days in the camp stretched into weeks, and with each passing moment, the German women began to realize that this strange world inside the American prison camp was nothing like what they had imagined. At first, Every action was tentative. Walking through the campyard felt foreign, touching the wooden benches. The fences, even the soil beneath their feet, required a quiet, hesitant caution. They had been trained to expect danger in every shadow, cruelty in every glance. Yet the camp was orderly, clean and calm. The barbed wire that circled the perimeter seemed less like a weapon of punishment and more like a quiet boundary, a clear line between the chaos they had escaped and a world that, for the moment, allowed them to breathe. Work was assigned to each woman, and it was unlike the labor they had known in the Reich. There were no tasks designed to humiliate, no brutal drills intended to break the spirit. Instead, the women found themselves tending gardens, washing laundry, assisting in the kitchens, and helping maintain the barracks. Some tasks were menial, some physically demanding, but all were purposeful. In tending to the gardens, they dug their hands into the soil, planting seeds that would grow into vegetables for the very people who had once been their enemies. The irony was not lost on them, and it was almost too much to process. They worked silently, speaking only in whispers, occasionally glancing at one another with looks that conveyed disbelief, wonder, and the fragile stirrings of hope. Inside the kitchens, a similar sense of wonder persisted. The women watched the American cooks move with practiced ease, preparing meals for hundreds without rush or cruelty. Sometimes they were allowed to help. One day, a young woman with sunken cheeks and trembling hands was shown how to knead dough, to fold it gently, to let it rise. The simple act of preparing bread became an unexpected form of therapy. She had once baked for her family, for holidays and celebrations, but now, in this strange place, she baked for survival, for the nourishment of both body and spirit. Others learned to clean utensils, to organize storage, to measure ingredients precisely. The discipline was strict but fair, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, they were praised for their work rather than punished. Laughter began to return slowly, cautiously. At first, it was a whisper in the corner of the barracks, a giggle exchanged between two women as they compared the meals they had received that day. Gradually it grew louder, small jokes, teasing about who had gotten the largest portion of bread, laughter at clumsy attempts to carry too many trays. These moments were fleeting but monumental. After years of fear and deprivation, laughter was a dangerous yet exhilarating feeling. It was proof that life, despite everything, could still exist in fragments of joy. The American Guards maintained a careful balance of authority and humanity. They were strict when rules needed enforcement, but there was never cruelty. They treated the women firmly, but with respect. A young female prisoner assigned to clean a barrack once dropped a bucket, spilling water across the wooden floor. In other contexts, such an accident might have led to shouting, punishment, or ridicule. Here, a guard simply nodded, saying quietly, "Try again. Take your time." There was no humiliation, only patience, and for the women, this was a revelation. The boundaries of their fear slowly began to loosen. Medical care, too, became part of daily life. Women who had been sick, weak from hunger, or suffering from untreated injuries were attended to by camp nurses and doctors. The sound of footsteps in the infirmary, once associated with fear, became reassuring. Bandages were applied gently, medicines distributed without scorn, and patients were encouraged to rest, to recover. Some women who had been on the brink of collapse slowly regained strength. For many, it was a revelation that health, safety, and attention could exist even for those who were officially enemies. The gardens became a particular point of transformation. The women who worked there would rise before dawn, shovels in hand, the earth cooled beneath their fingers. They planted rows of vegetables, tending each seed with care, watching as shoots pushed through the soil, fragile and determined. They laughed when birds tried to peck at the seedlings, scolded the mischievous animals, and shared their hopes for the future. One woman whispered to a tiny sprout, "Grow strong, like we will." The irony, that they were cultivating life in a place where they had once expected only suffering, was not lost on anyone. These gardens became symbols of resilience, small patches of normalcy in a world that had been defined by chaos. Daily routines provided structure. Each day was divided between work, meals, and rest. The repetitive rhythm, once expected to be harsh and punitive, instead brought comfort. The women could predict their meals, the time for chores, the moments of silence and reflection. The certainty of this routine was unfamiliar but deeply grounding. No one shouted in anger, no one punished without reason. Even small infractions, like being late to a task, were met with correction, not cruelty. The women began to internalize this structure, discovering in it an unexpected sense of dignity. Friendships began to form, tentative and fragile at first. Women who had been strangers only days before shared meals, whispered fears, and quietly supported each other. They spoke of their lives before the war. Towns lost to bombings, families scattered, jobs that no longer existed. They shared memories of moments of beauty, however small, and found solace in knowing they were not alone in their suffering. In the shared experiences of labor, meals, and quiet reflection, bonds formed that had been impossible to imagine in the chaos of the outside world. Evenings in the camp were moments of reflection. After work and meals, the women would gather in small clusters, sometimes near the garden, sometimes within the barracks, speaking softly, sharing fragments of their past lives. The stories carried grief and guilt, but also resilience. They recounted nights spent in fear, of soldiers lost, of families that would never reunite. Yet in telling these stories, they also began to reclaim a part of themselves that had been buried beneath layers of survival instinct. They were no longer just prisoners. They were human beings allowed to remember, to mourn, and to dream. Over time, a quiet rhythm developed between the prisoners and the guards. The women observed the humanity of the Americans. Young men who laughed quietly among themselves, who shared small gestures of kindness, who approached their duties with fairness. The prisoners learned to see them not merely as captors, but as individuals navigating the aftermath of war themselves. Conversations, when they occurred, were cautious but honest. The language barrier was bridged with patience, gestures, and broken words. Slowly, understanding began to emerge. The first real spring in the camp brought a subtle but powerful transformation. Flowers began to bloom near the barracks. The gardens flourished, birds returned. The women walked through the camp with a sense of awareness, noticing details that had gone unseen before. The way sunlight reflected off wooden beams, the gentle rustle of leaves, the call of a distant bird. These small signs of life, combined with the ongoing kindness of their captors, created a sense of hope that had been foreign to them for years. The camp, once merely a prison, had begun to feel like a place of refuge. Some women, however, continued to struggle with disbelief. They feared this humanity was a prelude to cruelty, a final test of their trust. But even in their reluctance, they could not ignore the evidence. Consistent meals, clean living conditions, structured work, medical care, and respectful treatment. Gradually, skepticism softened. replaced by a fragile acceptance. The realization that the camp offered more than survival, that it offered dignity, routine, and care, slowly took root. The women began to understand that their lives, though bound by confinement, could also be sustained by human compassion. They started to invest in small joys, the way sunlight fell across a table, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of laughter in the barracks. Every act of care from the Americans became a reminder that life could continue even after devastation. By the end of several months, the women had undergone a subtle yet profound transformation. They no longer saw themselves solely as prisoners, stripped of rights and humanity. They were workers, helpers, and caretakers of their own small universe within the camp. They experienced moments of laughter, reflection, and quiet companionship. They had found small freedoms within boundaries, freedom of thought, memory, and emotion, even under the constant watch of guards. The camp itself became a teacher. Its gardens, kitchens, and orderly routines imparted lessons in resilience, patience, and understanding. Its guards, disciplined but humane, demonstrated that authority did not need cruelty, and the women gradually began to reclaim parts of themselves that had been thought lost forever. The ability to feel hope, to care for others, and to recognize humanity even in those once considered enemies. By the time spring transitioned into summer, the camp had changed them irrevocably. Hunger, fear, and trauma had not disappeared entirely, but they had learned that life could be rebuilt. Even in confinement, even after unimaginable suffering, the simple acts of work, shared meals, and daily observation of care and fairness had created an environment where trust, slowly and cautiously, could flourish. In these quiet weeks, the women realized that the camp had done something extraordinary. It had reminded them that survival alone was not enough, that even in war, even as prisoners, human dignity and empathy could exist. And in understanding that, they began to see their captors not as monsters but as men, and themselves not merely as prisoners but as individuals capable of resilience and even hope. By the time the distant echoes of war had faded beyond the horizon, the women in the camp had undergone a transformation that was almost imperceptible at first, but profound in its implications. They had arrived months earlier, weary, distrustful, hollow-eyed from starvation and fear, each carrying the weight of a defeated nation on her shoulders. They had expected humiliation, cruelty, and the sting of punishment for being associated with the losing side. And yet, what they found was an unfamiliar world, one governed by rules, yes, but tempered by kindness and human decency. That simple revelation was enough to unsettle them deeply, and in its subtlety, to begin reshaping their understanding of what captivity could be. In the first days, every gesture of care felt foreign and almost suspicious. Clean blankets, warm meals, and polite instructions were small miracles in a life that had known only deprivation and harsh commands. Each night they lay on wooden bunks, marveling at the relative comfort, feeling the fabric of the blankets against their skin in disbelief. The quiet dignity of the camp, the lack of violent reprisal, and the consistency of order created a cognitive dissonance that they could neither fully explain nor immediately accept. They whispered to one another late at night, sharing fragmented reflections, asking over and over, "Why are they being so human?" Even as fear slowly loosened its grip, the women realized that the absence of cruelty could be just as shocking as cruelty itself. Meals became more than sustenance. They became a daily ritual of wonder, disbelief, and reflection. The tables were laden with fresh bread, steaming soup, milk, and fruit. These simple, ordinary items carried with them a weight that the women could hardly comprehend. For years they had subsisted on scraps, moldy potatoes, and the occasional smuggled morsel. And now, in this hall, the world seemed to offer abundance. At first, many could not eat, fearing a hidden threat or trap. Their fingers trembled over trays of food, eyes wide with hesitation. But as the days went on, as each meal arrived without deception or harm, the disbelief began to yield to quiet acceptance, and then, gradually, to gratitude. Eating became an act of reclaiming their bodies, of restoring what starvation had stolen, and of acknowledging a form of mercy they had never known. The camp structure, its daily routines, its work assignments, its clear rules, provided a framework in which the women could rebuild a sense of agency. They swept floors, tended gardens, helped in kitchens, and repaired barracks. There were no humiliating tasks designed to break the spirit. Every assignment, though sometimes demanding, was purposeful. For some, kneeling in the soil, planting seeds, and watching life grow became a metaphor for their own fragile hope. Each day ended with small victories, a garden row successfully planted, a kitchen task completed, a laundry line filled with freshly washed clothes fluttering in the wind. These acts, though ordinary, became monumental markers of their resilience and slowly helped restore their sense of self. Even in the midst of routine, the women were confronted with a strange new emotion: trust. They learned that the American Guards were consistent, disciplined, and above all, fair. There were moments when accidents happened, when mistakes were made, yet punishment was measured and never cruel. A dropped bucket, a spilled tray, a misstep in the garden, each was met with instruction rather than scorn. Slowly a cautious trust began to grow. They saw in these men not monsters, but human beings with their own burdens, their own stories, their own vulnerabilities. Through small gestures, a cup of water, a nod of approval, a quiet word of instruction, the guards demonstrated that authority could coexist with empathy. Over time, the women's perception of themselves began to shift. The labels of enemy and prisoner remained. Yet they discovered that their identity could also encompass dignity, purpose, and humanity. Conversations in the barracks became spaces for reflection, confession, and shared sorrow. They spoke of families lost, homes destroyed, and dreams shattered. And yet, in these exchanges, they found not only grief but also community. The shared experience of surviving, working, and eating together created bonds stronger than fear, a sense that they were no longer isolated in their suffering. They began to notice one another, to offer comfort, and to find solace in shared recognition of trauma. The phrase whispered among them, "So much food and no whips," became emblematic of the paradox that defined their existence in the camp. It captured the disbelief at being treated with humanity when they had anticipated only cruelty. It symbolized the shattering of assumptions, the confrontation with unexpected mercy, and the fragile beginnings of understanding between former enemies. Each utterance carried layers of meaning: relief, incredulity, gratitude, shame, and a dawning comprehension that the world could operate on principles of decency, even amid the aftermath of war. Evenings were times of introspection. The women would sit quietly on their bunks or near the gardens, reflecting on the passage of time and the gradual reclamation of their own lives. They thought of the cities they had left behind, the destruction they had witnessed, and the people they had lost, and yet, in the small acts of care surrounding them, a hot meal, a clean blanket, a gentle word, They began to see a path forward, however tenuous. They had been broken by history, yet slowly, through routine, nourishment, and the demonstration of mercy, they were being pieced back together. As weeks turned into months, the camp became a world of contrasts. Outside, the war had ravaged Europe, leaving cities in ruins and families shattered. Inside, a small community of women discovered the possibility of order, empathy, and even joy. They celebrated small achievements quietly, a garden row thriving, a successfully baked loaf of bread, a moment of laughter shared in the barracks. Each success became a quiet assertion of life, a refusal to be defined solely by the trauma they had endured. They observed the Americans with growing clarity. These men, who could have been vengeful, who could have imposed suffering in retaliation for the destruction their country had endured, chose instead patience and fairness. The women noted their humanity, their smiles, their fatigue, their moments of levity, their silent gestures of understanding. Slowly, they learned to see beyond the roles of captor and prisoner, recognizing the complexity of human beings shaped by war yet capable of kindness. The passage of time in the camp also allowed for memory to resurface in ways that were both painful and restorative. The women recalled lives before the war. Classrooms, kitchens, offices, quiet streets, and family gatherings. They remembered moments of tenderness, laughter, and security, sometimes with sorrow, sometimes with warmth. These memories, once suppressed by necessity, began to re-emerge in the context of a place that allowed them to feel safe, to rest, to heal. They began to imagine futures beyond confinement. They thought of returning to homes, to families, to rebuilding what had been lost. Even if Europe lay in ruin, even if their personal lives were forever altered, they began to believe that life could continue in meaningful ways. The structure, care, and unexpected kindness they experienced inside the camp planted seeds of hope, proving that humanity could persist even in the aftermath of cruelty and devastation. The transformation was subtle yet profound. By living in a place where their captors offered food without violence, work without degradation, and care without condescension, the women began to reclaim their dignity. Their identities were no longer solely defined by their status as prisoners or by the horrors they had endured. They were individuals capable of thought, reflection, and emotion. They were survivors who could, despite the scars of war, recognize goodness and kindness in others. Eventually, the camp became a microcosm of what could be, a place where life, order, and humanity could exist alongside the remnants of chaos outside its fences. The women internalized these lessons in ways both conscious and unconscious, understanding that their captors' actions had provided more than sustenance. They had offered the restoration of the soul, a quiet education in mercy, and an opportunity to trust again. The phrase, "so much food and no whips," came to symbolize more than just disbelief at abundance. It encapsulated the totality of their experience, the juxtaposition of expectation and reality, cruelty and kindness, fear and relief. It was a mantra of reflection, whispered quietly among the women, marking the emotional evolution from captive to human being, from victim to survivor, from enemy to witness of a profound truth that mercy can exist even in the darkest of times. By the time their eventual release drew near, the women were no longer the same individuals who had entered the camp months before. They had been transformed by routine, nourishment, work, quiet gestures of humanity, and the simple act of being treated as human beings deserving care and dignity. They'd entered as prisoners, hungry, broken, and fearful. They left with memories of mercy, a renewed sense of self, and the understanding that even in the aftermath of war, life could offer sustenance not only for the body, but for the spirit.